What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be taking a deep dive into each of the UFC 272 main card fights from a betting perspective. We're going to be taking a deep dive into each of these matchups, and I hope that you're going to be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions and maybe even earn some extra cash. And don't forget, if you'd like to watch breakdown videos for all the other fights taking place on this card, all of those prelim matchups, all you need to do, head on over to my website mmabettingtips.com, find a link to that in the description below, and on there you will find breakdown videos for every single matchup. You'll also find a VIP chat room where you can communicate with myself every single day, as well as a wide range of bets on different types of aspects of betting on MMA, such as over-unders, prop bets, moneyline bets, that kind of thing. They're pretty much all profitable. I'm sure you'll like it. Go and check it out. But remember, nothing that you hear from me in this video is financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do. Please do your own research on these fights if you're thinking of placing some bets this weekend. And do always remember to gamble responsibly. Having said that, I do make a living from betting on MMA. I've been doing this for a very long time, and I've put a lot of time and work into researching each of these matchups that I'm going to talk to you about today. So the information that I'm going to be sharing with you is coming from a pretty good place, but as always, do your own research. So the first fight that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be the main event, Covington against Jorge Masvidal. I've got to be honest, it has been a very, very, very long time since I was looking forward to a fight this much. I'm someone that probably spends 20 to 30 hours every single week watching fights, and so you know what they say, if you do anything in life, no matter how much you love it, eventually it does turn from a passion into a job. And so I don't really get that excited for individual fights anymore, because every week we've got a new set of 12 fights to research. That's going to take 20 to 30 hours of work. And, watching fights just kind of becomes a normal part of everyday work for me. So I don't get any more excited about one fight than I would another. But every once in a while, a very, very special kind of matchup comes along, which does grip me and capture my attention. And this fight is one that I cannot wait to see what happens. It's such a compelling matchup because you've got two guys with huge egos, huge personalities that do not believe it is possible for them to lose. They are 100% confident that they're going to go in there and win on Saturday night, and they absolutely hate each other. And it's such an interesting matchup because there has to be a loser, right? Both these guys can't win. Something's got to give. And this fight could be one of those career-defining fights where the loser will always be remembered for that loss. That loss will define their career. And who knows what the winner could go on to achieve, after this. But the winner will always be remembered for winning, this big rivalry. So it's such an interesting matchup. It's extremely high stakes with how much hatred and passion and emotion there is in this matchup. This is far bigger than any title fight, in my opinion, in terms of what's at stake, in terms of legacy. And so it's super interesting. Obviously, whenever we're dealing with Colby, there's a lot of pantomime, and you never really know what is true and what is not, and what is genuine and what is not. And I will say this, I don't know if Colby really hates George. I don't know if he hates Masvidal, because the way Colby is behaving going into this fight is not that different in terms of the way, his behavior, his personality, his attitude. It's really not that different compared to how he's been going into previous matchups. So I'm not sure how genuine the hatred is on Colby's side, but I could tell with 110% certainty that Masvidal absolutely hates Colby. There's no doubt about that. When you listen to Masvidal talk about this guy, he wants to kill him. There is no doubt in my mind about that. So with Colby, he's a difficult guy to read. He plays a character. Who really knows what's going on in Colby's head, right? But Masvidal is all in with this one, and it's a crazy fight. I can't wait for this. I'm so excited for this matchup. It's going to be a lot of fun on Saturday night. But how do we approach this from a betting point of view? So as always, we'll start off by looking at the odds on this one. And as we can see, Colby is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.30. which is minus 333 for an implied probability of 77%. And if we look at the odds on Masvidal, he is currently around about an average of 3.70, which is going to be plus 270 for an implied probability of 27%. So Colby is an absolutely massive favourite in this matchup, which means in order to bet Colby in any capacity in this fight, he's got to have virtually no way to lose. So that's a big part of what we'll be focusing on when we analyse how these two guys match up from a betting point of view. And it's always important to state that, we're not trying to predict who is more likely to win with these breakdowns. We're trying to work out which bet would give you the better risk to reward ratio, because we know in order to make money in this game, it's all about putting your money in strong positions and trying to find good risk to reward ratios in terms of those odds. So we will start in our analysis at looking at the X factors in this one, because there are a few, and I do think they could have or are likely to have quite a notable impact on how this one plays out. We've already touched on the first one, which is the bad blood and the beef between these two. That is certainly an X factor, but if we explore that a little bit deeper and, try to maybe work out what impact that could have on the performances of both guys coming into Saturday night, it's one of those things where I only see it making this fight better and more competitive. We know that some fighters don't perform well when they get, really angry and really amped up and they hate their opponent, right? It makes it very difficult for them to perform at their best. They're more likely to adrenaline dump, and they can just basically get caught up in a fit of rage, not think clearly, and significantly underperform. But then there are other fighters that thrive on that hatred, that thrive on that bad blood, to the extent that there are some fighters, Marvin Vettori is probably a pretty good example of this, that will actually seek to manufacture bad blood between his opponent simply because he knows he performs better when it exists. And now I don't know whether Colby is the kind of guy that performs better with or without bad feeling and bad energy between him and his opponent, because realistically he manages to piss off just about everyone he's fighting. So that's kind of a difficult one to work out, because Colby is so much different as a fighter now to how he was back when he didn't kind of play this character which worked hard to get under the skin of every single opponent that he's faced since Damian Maia. But what I do think we know for sure with Masvidal is that Masvidal definitely thrives off the bad blood. I think Masvidal is one of these guys that's going to be at his best when there's a little bit of an edge to the matchup. I don't think Masvidal's the kind of guy that's going to adrenaline dump or, be unable to stick to a game plan or a strategy or underperform because he'll be so clouded by rage that he just won't be able to perform. I think if anything, this will bring out the best in Masvidal. It will lead him to train harder and prepare better than ever before. And, I think that we're going to see the best version of Masvidal on Saturday night that we could possibly see. But I choose my words very carefully there. When I say I expect to see the best version of Masvidal on Saturday night we could possibly see, I mean in this moment, in this time in 2022. In terms of, I think Masvidal will perform on Saturday night to the best of his ability. I don't mean I think on Saturday night we're going to see the best version of Masvidal we've ever seen, for my next point, which is the age of Masvidal and the miles that he's got on the clock. So if we look at the ages of these two, Colby Covington's 34 years old and he's had 19 pro fights. Masvidal is 37 years old. He's going to be 38 years old this year. And he's had 50 pro fights and God knows how many street fights and wars in the gym, and, God knows, how many fights Masvidal's actually had in his lifetime. But in terms of professional mixed martial arts contests, 50 pro fights. That's more than double the amount that Covington has had. And that is a hell of a lot of miles on the clock. To add to that, you look at the level of opponent that Masvidal has been facing throughout his career. From very, very early on in Masvidal's career, he has been consistently fighting against some of the best fighters in the world. If we go all the way back and we look at his record, he was fighting Joe Lauzon, Joe Lauzon and Rafael Assunção very, very early on in his career. Yves Edwards very, very early on. Guys like Rodrigo Damno Picnic. But then when he finally made it to, a decent promotion, which was, Strikeforce. Let's go one before that. I remember the Shark Fights fight back in the day being promoted. It was like a really small promotion that was trying to, trying to emerge as like a new big promotion by putting on interesting fights. And so Paul Daly and Masvidal headlined this card, which was a big fight because I think Paul Daly had just been released from the UFC for that incident with Koscheck where he punched him after the fight. And Masvidal was available, and so they did this big exciting fight. But anyway, point being, since 2010, 12 years ago, we've seen Masvidal consistently compete against the best fighters in the world. So this isn't 50 pro fights against absolute nobodies on regional circuits. This is the Paul Dalys, the KJ Noonses, the Gilbert Burnses, the Tim Means, the Michael Chiesas, the Rustam Kabalovs, the Pat Healys, the James Krause. Darren Cruikshank was no picnic back in the day. And so not only does Masvidal have a lot of fights, but he's got a lot of fights under against a very good level of opponent, which is going to result in him taking a lot more damage and a lot more wear and tear on his body. On top of that, for a big chunk of Masvidal's career, he was considered to be a decisionator. If you look at his record, you can see lots of fights here have gone the distance. And this is significant because when a fight goes the distance, it puts a lot more wear and tear on your body. If you go out there like Masvidal and, knock out your opponent like Ben Askren here in 5 seconds or wherever it was, well, that's a clean, easy night's work where you don't take any damage, you don't put much wear and tear on your body. You could probably fight again next week, no problem. But when you're consistently, every 2-3 months getting into these, 15-minute back and forth wars, it's bound to take a toll on you. And so Masvidal, at 38 years old, with 50 pro fights that we know about against a very high level of opponent for the majority of his career, and on top of that, with many of those fights going the distance, I mean, he may as well be 138 years old in terms of miles on the clock and wear and tear on the body. But Masvidal, game bred, he's an absolute dog. He's a warrior. He's got the heart of a lion. And he does show all the characteristics of a guy who may not accept this, right? Fighting is in his blood. It defines him. It's in his DNA. And so what's tricky about a guy like Masvidal is that Father Time is undefeated. This doesn't end well. There's no happy endings. This is a young man's sport. And Masvidal is starting to tick a lot of the boxes which would accompany someone or fit the profile of a fighter that was probably going to start declining very, very significantly. And when a fighter does start to decline, welterweight, usually like from 34 years onwards, 33 years old is when a fighter's at his prime. And then every year after the age of 33 years old, the male body starts to produce significantly lower levels of testosterone. You'll always get outliers like Daniel Cormier, but it isn't smart to make betting decisions based on outliers and exceptions to the rule. Eric Crown, a guy that taught me everything I know about trading, please go check out his YouTube channel, Crown's Crypto Cave. He's got this great quote, this great expression that he always uses. That is, the trend is your friend until the end of the trend. And what he means by that is, you know what the trend is, right? The trend moves in one direction. The trend will give you certain outcomes which we know are more likely. So if you stick with the trend and bet with a trend, even if you have absolutely no idea what you're doing, you're probably going to win a lot more than you're going to lose, because the trend, once established, we know it works, and we know generally that's how things play out. When you look at Masvidal, he ticks so many boxes of a fighter that is likely to be on a very steep decline now, because he is very old, he's got a lot of miles on the clock, he's taken a lot of damage in his career, and he's got a lot of wear and tear on his body. Now, Masvidal is a fighter that has built a career off having a granite chin, an unbreakable spirit, and just being a tough guy, right? Very, very, very tough. And if you look at Masvidal's record, what's actually astonishing about his record is how difficult he's been to finish. If you look at his record, he got knocked out by Kamaru Usman in his last fight. But prior to that, you look at his losses: decision, 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 decision. And we don't know how that fight ended. It doesn't say. Lost to submission there and lost to strikes there against Rodrigo Dam all the way back in 2008. But what this shows us is it's very difficult to put Masvidal away. Prior to his last fight, it looks like he hasn't been finished due to strikes in 14 years, which is extremely impressive when you take into consideration that within that time he has been consistently competing against some of the nastiest, best fighters in the UFC or in Strikeforce. So Masvidal's tough, but remember the second part of that quote from Eric Crown. The trend is your friend until the end of the trend. And so a trend doesn't last forever. Some trends last forever, right? MMA being a young man's sport is a trend that is going to last forever. We know, generally speaking, younger fighters are going to have an advantage over older fighters when there's a big age gap until the end of time. That's just how biology works. Until cybernetics and all that kind of stuff starts coming in, that's a trend that we can pretty much trust. Trend is your friend until the end of the trend. But there's another trend at play with this matchup, and that is the trend that George Masvidal's got a granite chin and he's very, very difficult to put away. You look at his record, he's only really lost due to strikes twice in the last 14 years, and one of them, was his last fight against one of the greatest welterweights of all time, Kamaru Usman. So there's a trend that Masvidal's very tough, very difficult to put away, and has a very good chin. So why am I saying this, right? Why am I saying this? And it's because it's very, very important to identify the signs that a trend might be coming to an end. Because a big part of the narrative coming into this fight is that Masvidal's going to have an advantage standing, and he's, tough and durable and difficult to put away. Colby's going to find it difficult on the feet. But I'm not sure that's going to be the case, because the devil is always in the detail. This is why it's a very dangerous game to play, to use stats to make betting decisions, because ultimately betting sites and bookies, they can see all the same stats as you. The way you really find an edge is through qualitative analysis. The devil is in the detail. And if you go and watch his last fight against Kamaru Usman, it wasn't just a knockout. It wasn't just a knockout that happened. Sometimes guys get knocked out and you're like, oh damn, just got caught, flash KO. Geez, that's unlucky. Not the case with the Masvidal versus Usman fight. If you go back and watch that matchup in the cold light of day, for me, Masvidal was showing all the signs of a fighter whose reflexes were starting to go. And if you watch a lot of MMA, if you've been watching MMA for a long time, if you study a lot of MMA, you will be able to spot those signs. And the signs are, when a guy starts to react to a shot after it's landed, that's usually the beginning of the end for them in terms of their reflexes starting to go. So if you go back and watch that Kamaru Usman fight, you will see 4 or 5 times before the shot lands that eventually knocked him out. And I don't mean immediately before, I mean scattered throughout round 1. There's 4 or 5 occasions where Kamaru Usman lands a clean, hard shot on Masvidal and he doesn't react to it until after it's landed. That is a sign that a guy's reflexes are totally shot, and a sign that they could be on a pretty significant decline. So the trend is your friend until the end of the trend. The trend throughout Masvidal's career has been he's very tough, very difficult to put away. He's got a great chin. But all good things come to an end. Father Time is undefeated. We know that. That's a trend in itself, right? Father Time's undefeated. That's a trend in itself. And at almost 38 years old, 50 pro fights, a massive amount of wear and tear on his body and miles on the clock. I do have a feeling that we may be about to witness the rapid and violent decline of Masvidal, which would be a really, really upsetting thing to see, because he's one of my favourite fighters of all time. I absolutely love Masvidal, but unfortunately this is a cycle that over the last 20 years of watching MMA, I have seen play out over and over and over and over and over again. Father Time has claimed all my favourite fighters, Anderson Silva, Wanderlei Silva, Michael Bisping, you name it, all my favourite fighters have fallen foul to Father Time. And so eventually he'll take Masvidal as well. And I do think if you go back and watch that first round against Usman in particular, there are warning signs, clear and obvious warning signs, that Masvidal is also on an extremely steep decline at the moment. And what I will say is, the further you get away from 33 years old, the faster the decline will be, to the extent that once you start to get in the late 30s, from one fight to the next, you can look like an absolute shadow of yourself. So that is something that is really important to take in consideration in this matchup, because on the surface, if we take a really simplified look at this fight, it would appear to be a classic striker versus grappler matchup, right? Where Masvidal will have the advantage on the feet, Colby will have the advantage on the ground. I don't know if that's the case here. I actually think Colby might beat Masvidal everywhere. I think Colby at this stage in Masvidal's career is likely to be able to outstrike him as well. And I don't feel great saying that, but all you can do is make the best decision possible with the information you've got available. And that's just what I've seen. So, when it comes to who is more likely to win this one, the problem Masvidal has is that he doesn't have many options. One of the things that's got Masvidal into trouble throughout his career is that he doesn't really have a plan B. He's just a striker with a style predominantly based in boxing, and while his kicks are good, his grappling's all right, he's a very well-rounded fighter. In terms of the threat he poses to his opponents, aside from boxing, there's not a lot there. And so if that isn't working for him in a fight, if his boxing isn't getting the job done for him, there's very little for him to fall back on. There are very few options for him. Compare that to Colby Covington, who is bringing much more weapons to this fight. He's got extremely good wrestling. Former NCAA Division 1 wrestler, right? Very, very good wrestling. People don't like to give Colby credit for his boxing, but he's a pretty damn good boxer as well. Colby's a very good striker. And not only that, but Colby has the gas tank to sprint for 25 minutes no matter where this fight takes place. So the blueprint has kind of been written on how to beat Masvidal by Kamaru Usman in their first fight back on Fight Island, where all you need to do is push a relentless pace, make Masvidal grapple very, very hard early on in the matchup, wear him down to the extent that his arms are kind of too heavy to really cause you a problem in the second half of the matchup, and then he becomes a bit of a pussycat. That's what makes this a very difficult fight for Masvidal, because while his takedown defense is very good, and at times he's difficult to hold down, he's very, very good at scrambling back up to his feet. With a guy like Colby, it is very difficult to create enough time and space for yourself to have any success, unless you're a godlike wrestler like Usman that can completely neutralize Colby's grappling. What I mean by that is, Masvidal may have some success stuffing Colby's takedowns and keeping the fight standing, but Masvidal won't be able to keep Colby off of him. He won't be able to stop Colby from getting to that body lock, wearing on him in the clinch against the cage, and just making it an ugly, awkward, grindy, wet blanket, John Fitch type of fight, if that's what Colby wants to do. There's not a lot Masvidal can do to stop Colby from doing that. And that's a problem, because even though Colby may not score many points in a position, in positions like that, he will be putting points in the bag for later on in the fight, where Masvidal will be too worn down to pose a threat to Colby. Now, I'm not saying Masvidal's got a bad gas tank or anything like that, but if he's got Colby hanging off him for the first 2 rounds, he's not, his arms, his hand speed, it's just not going to be as sharp, right? Fatigue will set in. And that's a problem, because we know Colby is just as effective in round 5 as he is in round 1. So Colby has the blueprint, the game plan, the strategy, and the skill set to cause Masvidal big trouble here, because he can wear Masvidal down early on, and then he can completely dominate the fight late on. And I don't think Masvidal's got a huge advantage on the feet. Maybe 2-3 years ago, Masvidal would have had a big advantage on the feet. But within that time, Colby's improved his striking tremendously. And Masvidal, I believe, is on a decline. And as a result of that, perhaps Masvidal doesn't realise what he's getting himself into here, which I believe is an extremely difficult fight for Masvidal. So, like I say, Masvidal's one of my favourite fighters of all time. I love this guy, but this, from a stylistic point of view, is a nightmare for him. I have this expression within my community that every once in a while, and it's very rare you get fights like this, but every once in a while you run into a checkmate fight where a fighter has pretty much every single advantage he could possibly want, and his opponent, as a result, has a very limited path to victory. Maybe Masvidal catches Colby with a flying knee or something right in 5 seconds and knocks him out. That's MMA. It's a chaotic sport. It's why we love it. These things can happen. But if both guys show up to their and perform to their full potential, and Colby doesn't get flash KO'd, I struggle to see how Masvidal wins this fight, because I don't think he can keep up with the pace that Colby sets. His reflexes looked shot in round 1. Imagine what his reflexes are going to look like in rounds 3 and 4 if Colby's been hanging off him in the clinch and in grappling positions for, 5, 10, 15 minutes. So it's a very, very difficult fight for Masvidal. There's no way I would bet this guy is a big underdog as a result. The question really is, do you want to bet Colby as a big favourite? I mean, only you can make that decision. Personally, it doesn't excite me. I can put my money in much stronger positions than this. Live betting football, live betting the UFC, betting other fighters on this card with better odds. These odds do not excite me at all, and I'm not a parlay guy. But in fights where there's often a big favourite and a big underdog, you'll often catch me saying, this is a dog or pass fight. I don't think this one is. I think if you really, really must bet this one, I would take Colby. Because if you bet Masvidal, maybe you get lucky. But I think probably 8 or 9 times out of 10, you're throwing your money into the fire. So I hope you found that breakdown video useful. And let me know what you think in the comments below. It's a hyped up fight. A lot of people got some strong opinions on it. Both guys are very popular, so I know there'll probably be 2 camps of people with really passionate opinions. Let me know what you think, but I do think it goes pretty bad for Masvidal on Saturday night. So we'll now get into talking about the co-main event, which is going to be Rafael dos Anjos and Renato Moicano. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Rafael dos Anjos is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.57, which is minus 175 for an implied probability of 64%. And if we take a look at the odds on Renato Moicano, he is currently around about an average of 2.50, which is plus 250 for an implied probability of 40%. So in the eyes of the bookies, the betting public, everyone that could have an influence on these odds, this fight's roughly 60-40 in favour of Rafael dos Anjos, and I do understand why. So if we start off by taking a look at the X factors on this one. So we've just spoken a lot about the miles on the clock for Masvidal and the age, and the same applies to Rafael dos Anjos. He's had over 40 pro fights. He is going to be 38 years old this year also. And on top of that, he's obviously been in a lot of wars. He's put a lot of wear and tear on his body. He's had a lot of injuries. A lot of his fights have gone a distance, so he spent a lot of time in the octagon, putting wear and tear on his body. And on top of that, he's another guy like Masvidal who's been around forever. And as a result, for a very long time, for a big chunk of his career, he's been consistently competing against the best fighters in the world. And when you fight the best, you're obviously putting a lot more stress on your body, taking a lot more damage. So Father Time's going to come knocking for Masvidal pretty soon. Might not be Saturday night, but you could bet your fucking house on the fact it'll be sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. And the same can absolutely be said about Rafael dos Anjos. He's at that stage in his career where his athletic performance could just fall off a cliff overnight, and overnight he could look like a shadow of himself. But it's very difficult to know what we're going to get from dos Anjos on Saturday night, because he hasn't really shown any signs of decline. He showed signs of big decline back in 2016, back when USADA was first, brought in. There was a point in time back in 2014, 2015, when I think the version of Dos Anjos back in 2014, 2015, one of the best lightweights I've ever seen. I'd probably have him number 2 behind Khabib. The version of RDA we had back in 2014, 2015, when he was the lightweight champ, is one of the best 155-pound fighters I've ever seen. But he lost his way a little bit after USADA came in, went up to welterweight, which was, not a great move at 5'8", way too small to be a welterweight. And now, at this stage in his career, his last few fights, he started to look, much closer to his old self, and has looked pretty good. He's not a guy that is showing many signs of decline in recent years anyway. If anything, he's looking better now than he did back in 2017. But it is tricky to know what to expect from Rafael Dos Anjos this weekend, because we haven't seen him for a while. Last time we saw RDA was all the way back in November 2020 against Paul Felder, which was 14 months ago now. I remember what I said in the Masvidal breakdown and what I just said a few moments ago. When a fighter's in their late 30s, they can literally decline overnight, like out of nowhere. Like, they can decline hard and fast, and from one fight to the next look like a shadow of themselves. So that's a big risk factor with this one. We don't know what we're getting with Dos Anjos. And remember what I said, the trend is your friend until the end of the trend. If we trust that Dos Anjos is going to show up and look great on Saturday night, that certainly goes against the trend, because we've got a lot of things that point towards him declining sometime soon. He's old, he's got a lot of miles on the clock, he's taken a lot of damage, had a lot of injuries, and we haven't seen him for 14 months. What's he going to look like after 14 months? Now, we know how he's going to look physically. There's pictures, training pictures of him on his Instagram. He looks in phenomenal physical shape. I'm the same age as Dos Anjos, and I wish I looked this good. But, it's not always about how a fighter appears physically. You don't know how their reflexes, their decision making, their durability, all that kind of stuff is going to be affected by their age, right? The physique, the physical appearance of a fighter this old is only one part of the puzzle. So RDA would certainly be an outlier if he were to continue to perform at a high level for very much longer. So if you are thinking about an RDA this weekend, there's a pretty significant thing you need to take into consideration. If we look at Moicano, he's 32 years old, so he's going to be about 5 years younger than RDA. In terms of the size, RDA 5'8" with a 70-inch reach, and Moicano's 5'11" with a 72-inch reach. So what's very interesting about this is Renato Moicano is a little bit older, a little bit taller than RDA, but what's interesting about this is Moicano's obviously moved up from the featherweight to the lightweight division, and RDA has moved down from the welterweight to the lightweight division. I know RDA did start life as a lightweight, but you get what I'm saying. That's interesting because you would consider RDA to be the guy with the size advantage in this matchup, but in terms of wingspan, Moicano's actually the bigger guy. Another X factor to take into consideration is that Moicano is stepping up to take this fight on less than a week's notice after Rafael Fiziev pulled out of his scheduled fight against RDA. And as a result, this fight is being contested at a 160-pound catch weight. Now, what's very interesting about this catch weight is this catch weight is usually imposed to make it easier for the fighter stepping up on short notice to make weight. But what I find interesting about this catch weight is I actually think it could benefit RDA a lot more, because the main reason why RDA moved from lightweight to welterweight was because he had so much trouble making the weight limit of 156 pounds of the lightweight division. That extra 5-pound weight allowance to 161 pounds at this catch weight, I think is going to make the cut a lot easier for RDA, and that should bring out the best in RDA. Don't get me wrong, the weight cut, the catch weight is definitely going to help Moicano, because it would be brutal for him to go through a very hard weight cut on less than a week's notice, but it's not going to hurt RDA either. And I think out of the two, RDA is likely to benefit from it much more. So that's an interesting X factor. But in terms of the wingspan, Moicano is a little bit bigger. RDA is more compact, perhaps more muscular, physically imposing, but we know wingspan is quite important in MMA, and Moicano has the advantage in terms of wingspan. So in terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, again, it's a very interesting matchup where Moicano on the feet, I think, will have a lot of success. If you go back and watch RDA's fight against Paul Felder didn't have like a huge size difference over RDA in terms of his reach and length, but RDA still found it very difficult to get inside on Felder and land anything. Felder did a really good job of using his length to keep RDA out of a range where RDA could land. RDA would really have to come forward, bobbing and weaving, to get close enough to Felder to let his hands go. Moicano is far better at using his length than Felder is, because Felder's one of these guys that tends to stand right in front of you in a traditional Muay Thai stance, flat-footed, and just hammer you with every single one of his limbs. Moicano's a lot lighter on his feet. His footwork is a lot better. His movement, his mobility is a lot better, and he fights longer as well. So with RDA struggling to get to Felder on the feet, he's really likely to struggle to get to Moicano on the feet as well. Now, obviously, one issue with Moicano is that he does have a habit of getting rocked, dropped, wobbled, knocked out a lot. This guy gets dinged a lot. But RDA's never really had that kind of one-shot KO power. He tends to break guys down with volume. So while Moicano does get cracked a lot, RDA doesn't really have a history of cracking people. Even when RDA was, pre-USADA lightweight champion, absolutely murdering guys, he never really knocked them out. He tended to break them down with superior technique. So there's no doubt that RDA will be bigger and more powerful than Moicano on the feet. But I do think, even though the size and reach advantage is only slight for Moicano, I think the way that he fights long and the effectiveness of his ability to manage the distance I do think give RDA some trouble in this fight. Now, in terms of how these two guys match up on the ground, that is far more difficult to work out, because we don't really have a lot of information on Moicano's takedown defense. Let me show you what I mean. If we go to Moicano's fights in the UFC, at face value, his takedown defense looks very good, and this is why it's very dangerous to make betting decisions based on stats. You look at that and you go, 80% takedown defense, that looks pretty good. But when you actually dive into the detail, that statistic is very, 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 very meaningless. Because if we look at the Alexander Hernandez fight, Hernandez, where is it? There we go. If we look at the Alexander Hernandez fight, Hernandez only tried to take Moicano down one time, and by the time he tried to take Moicano down, he was too tired to get it. Alexander Hernandez was completely gassed in his second round when he tried to go to the takedown. If we look at the Jay Herbert fight, we can see that Jay Herbert didn't attempt any takedowns at all. If we look at the Rafael Fiziev fight, again, you can see only one takedown attempt from Fiziev, but he didn't fully commit to it, and we know that Fiziev isn't a wrestler anyway. He's predominantly a striker. The Damir Hadzovic fight, no takedown attempts there. If we look at the Korean Zombie fight, no takedown attempts there. If we look at the Jose Aldo fight, you can see that there were no takedowns from Aldo, or no takedown attempts from Aldo. Look at Cub Swanson, no takedown attempts from Cub. If we look at the Calvin Kattar fight, you can already guess where I'm going with this. Only 2 takedown attempts. And again, like with Fiziev, Calvin Kattar is not a wrestler, so didn't fully commit to those takedowns. Brian Ortega, we can see that Ortega only attempted 2 takedowns in round 3, didn't get either of them. And as we know, Ortega, not a very good offensive wrestler. If we look at the Jeremy Stephens fight, we can see 1 takedown attempt from Stephens, and he didn't get it. But again, Stephens is a striker. He is not a wrestler. The Zubair Tukhugov fight. There is some interesting footage in this one for us to dive into. If you go back and watch that fight, this one gives us the most information on his takedown defense. And as you can see, Moicano did pretty good defending takedowns in this fight against Tukagov, and then his UFC debut against Tom Ninamaki, no takedown attempts from Tom. So what you can see is here, on face value, takedown offense of 80% does look kind of impressive, but the majority of takedowns that make up this percentage came against strikers that didn't really fully commit to their takedowns, or grapplers who weren't particularly good offensive wrestlers. The only time we really had an opportunity to have a good look at Moicano's takedown defense was all the way back in 2016 against Zubair Tukagov, a fight that took place almost 6 years ago now. And it's very difficult to form an opinion on a fight that took place that long ago because, you know, Moicano could have improved so much since then. Why am I focusing so much on takedown defense? Well, the reason why I'm focusing so much on takedown defense is because Rafael dos Anjos is an amazing MMA grappler. Do not be misled by watching his fights against Michael Chiesa or Kamaru Usman, where both Chiesa and Usman were able to grab a hold of this guy and basically wet blanket him for the entire duration of the fight. Kamaru Usman is 6 foot tall, 76-inch reach, former NCAA Division III level wrestler, big, powerful, physically imposing, muscular guy. Rafael dos Anjos, 5'8", 70-inch reach, much smaller than Usman. Michael Chiesa, 6'1", 75-inch reach, same story. A big part of why Chiesa and Usman had so much success over RDA was because of how much bigger and physically imposing they were. Moicano doesn't have that luxury. Moicano's fought at featherweight. He's much more slight, much more lean. He won't be able to impose himself on RDA in grappling positions in the same way that Chiesa and Kamaru Usman could. So when I tell you Rafael dos Anjos is an amazing MMA grappler, trust me, he really is. His offensive wrestling is very good, and he's a very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I would give RDA a pretty big advantage on the ground. So what makes this fight difficult is that we haven't really seen very much of Renato Moicano's takedown defense. It's been 2016 since we saw him, defend any kind of meaningful takedowns that we could study. That was against Zubair Tukagov. But the problem with that fight is we know Tukagov has a pretty bad gas tank. And so from early in round 2, Tukagov was looking pretty flat. So we're not getting a true reflection of what Moicano's takedown defense is going to look like against someone as good of an offensive wrestler as Rafael dos Anjos is. So that makes this fight from a betting point of view pretty complicated, because I'm pretty sure that Moicano will have the edge on the feet from a technical point of view. That's not to say dos Anjos can't crack him and knock him out, because we know Moicano very, very susceptible to being dinged and knocked out, right? This is, this just a fact. But on the ground, it's a lot more difficult to call, because we don't know if RDA is going to be able to take Moicano down, because we don't have a lot of footage on Moicano's takedown defense. And if he does get Moicano down, we don't know if he's going to be able to hold him down, because again, there ain't a great deal of footage of Moicano on the bottom, right? We've seen plenty of fights with Moicano on the ground when he's the aggressor, he's the hammer. We haven't really seen much evidence of Moicano being the nail and defending himself against a very, very good MMA grappler, which Rafael dos Anjos is. So from a betting point of view, this is a very difficult one, because that huge gap in information in terms of what does Moicano's takedown defense look like makes it very difficult to lean confidently one way or the other here. You are taking quite a big gamble if you bet this fight. For that reason, that's too big of a gap in information for me. I've got no interest in betting this fight, but it's a complex, interesting matchup, and I'm very much looking forward to how it plays out. Of course, one more X factor I forgot to mention is that it's also a 5-round fight. And it's not going to be easy for Moicano to come off the bench and jump into a 5-round matchup. What I will say to rebut that, though, is that it wasn't that long ago that Moicano fought. We saw him a couple of weeks ago against Alexander Hernandez, and Moicano, for the most part, is a cardio machine, never gets tired. So if anyone can come off the bench, on a week's notice and perform well in a 5-round fight, it's going to be someone like Moicano that has built a career of being able to fight at a very high pace and be a cardio machine. So great fight. I just don't want to bet it. Into the next matchup now, where we're going to be talking about a super interesting stylistic matchup between Bryce Mitchell and Edson Barboza. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Bryce Mitchell is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.61, which is minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. And if we take a look at the odds on Edson Barboza, he's currently around an average of 2.45, which is plus 145 for an implied probability of 41%. So, such an interesting fight this. Mitchell, 27 years old, 5'10" with a 70-inch reach. Edson Barboza, 36 years old, 5'11" with a 75-inch reach. So I am noticing a recurring theme in this video, and that is Father Time talking about age. It has been a major factor to consider in the last two fights we've discussed. Definitely another major factor here. Bryce Mitchell, 27 years old. Barboza, 36 years old. That means there is a 9-year age gap in this fight, and the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. So we talk about betting with trends and staying on the right side of trends. If you're blind betting that statistic and trusting that over the long term that trend is going to be profitable for you, you do not want to be betting Barboza here. A 9-year age gap is a significant advantage for the younger fighter in a matchup like this, and that is definitely one X factor going against Barboza in this matchup. He is 36 years old, but he's quite an old 36 years old, because the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes, and athleticism. Those are some of the first qualities to go as a fighter starts to get old. So 36 years old is very, very old for a featherweight. 36 years old at light heavyweight, not as bad, because those weight classes rely a lot more on power. It's a big issue in the featherweight division when you start to approach your late 30s. So Father Time's going to come knocking for Barboza soon. On top of that, again, he's had over 30 pro fights, just like Masvidal, just like RDA. That is a lot of fights. And on top of that, he's been to a lot of decisions, a lot of wear and tear on his body, a lot of injuries. And on top of that, you can already guess what I'm going to say. I've already said it twice in this video. Edson Barboza has been around forever. Since he first entered the UFC all the way back in 2018, he has been fighting monsters back to back to back to back in every fight, consistently been competing against some of the best fighters in the world for the entire duration of his career, fighting guys like Anthony Njokuani, Ross Pearson, Terry Etim, Jamie Varner, very, very early on in his career. If you're familiar with any of those guys, you'll know absolute warriors, no tough fights in Barboza's early UFC career. And so a lot of miles on the clock. Like I said with Masvidal, Barboza may be 36 years old on paper. In fight miles, he might be 136 years old. This guy's got a lot of miles on the clock. That does give Bryce Mitchell a big advantage. In terms of wingspan, Mitchell is 5'10" with a 70-inch reach, and Edson Barboza's 5'11" with a 75-inch reach. That's a really nice 5-inch reach advantage for Barboza. Especially significant because Barboza's a guy that knows how to use it. Very high-level striker, understands distance, knows how to read that distance, and will know how to use that reach to punish a guy like Bryce Mitchell. But from a stylistic point of view, this is clearly a striker versus grappler matchup where Mitchell is predominantly a grappler and Edson Barboza predominantly a striker. And we know if the fight stays on the feet, it's likely to be very, very bad for Bryce Mitchell. If the fight goes to the ground, likely to be very, very bad for Barboza. So the question we've got to answer here is how likely is it that Bryce Mitchell's going to be able to get this fight to the ground and keep this fight on the ground? That is the big question with this matchup. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of footage available on both these guys to be able to answer that question with a good degree of conviction. I would say there's a lot of footage that gives us some clues as to how this one's likely to go down. So when you look at Edson Barboza, I cannot overstate how bad of a matchup this is for Mitchell if Mitchell can't get the fight to the ground. Mitchell is a very green striker, very low-level striker, doesn't set his takedowns up particularly well with his striking, and will be a sitting duck to the knockout on the feet. One huge problem that Mitchell has in this fight is that he doesn't have an efficient style of fighting. One of the things that makes him very dangerous is that when he goes and he fully commits to his grappling, he is all in. He commits so much energy to that grappling, and that's what makes him effective, because where he's going all in grappling positions, if you're not matching that, it's very difficult to stop him. In the breakdown for the last fight, we were talking about Moicano fighting some guys like Rafael Fiziev and Calvin Kattar who had kind of tried to take him down, but they hadn't fully committed to it. How much you commit to a takedown is everything. And when Bryce Mitchell goes, when he commits, he throws everything he's got into that takedown. And that's why his offensive wrestling is very difficult to stop. But the cost of that is that he burns himself out very, very quickly. And by the midway point of round 2, Bryce Mitchell is usually very tired and very sloppy. And if Edson Barboza can survive into sort of the 6, 7, 8 minute mark of this matchup, I think Bryce Mitchell is in a world of trouble. And I think it's very, very likely Edson Barboza will knock him out. However, early on in that first round, Mitchell is going to bring hellfire and brimstone. And it will be no picnic for Barboza keeping this fight standing. Barboza does have excellent takedown defense. There is no question. And Bryce Mitchell's offensive wrestling isn't great. When I say that, I mean from a technical point of view, his methods for getting fights to the ground are far more based on power and strength than they are on technique. And that's one of the reasons why he gasses himself out and burns himself out. Instead of using, really nice chain wrestling techniques to get fights to the ground, he'll just use bullish strength to pick guys up and dump them on the ground. And he burns through a lot of energy in the process. Those kind of guys like Bryce Mitchell can come unstuck when they go up against a guy like Barboza, who's going to be very good at reading the takedown entries, very good at getting underhooks in play, and very, very good at shutting guys down who down his entire career, right? Everyone Barboza's ever fought has tried to take him down. He's a striker. So Barboza does have exceptionally good takedown defense. And this will be by far the toughest guy Mitchell's ever had to face, because Barboza will not be as easy to take down as the previous guys Mitchell has fought. That's what makes this a very interesting matchup. So Mitchell is going to have to fight like hell to get this fight to the ground. But he will fight like hell. The question is, will it be good enough? Will Barboza's takedown defense be too big of a problem for him to solve? It's not going to be easy for Mitchell to get this fight to the ground, or at least I'd be very surprised. What I can say, though, is Barboza's one of these guys that is very difficult to take down. Very, very, very difficult to take down. But if you do get him to the ground, he's very easy to hold down and control. And we know that Mitchell's got, pretty nasty grappling control, pretty heavy top game. And so if he does get Barboza down, he's going to have a hell of a lot of success on the ground. Problem is, it's not easy taking Barboza down. And that's what makes this such an interesting fight. So for me, this one is a tricky one from a betting point of view. I know I've said that on the last 2 fights, but it shouldn't be any surprise to anyone watching this that betting sites are run by big multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies. They're going to cap a lot of fights right. You've just got to kind of accept that. If you are finding a situation where you disagree with their odds a lot of the time, it's far more likely you're probably not reading the fight correctly. A lot of the time, bookies are going to have these fights sewn up. And this is one of those fights where I think the odds are dead accurate. Because the way I would look at this is, I understand why Bryce Mitchell is the favourite, because he's a lot younger than Barboza. We know Barboza is very, very weak if you can put him on the ground. And we know that Bryce Mitchell's an absolute nightmare on the ground. On top of that, Barboza is likely to be declining from fight to fight at this stage in his career. And early on, this fight is likely to be very tough for Barboza, because we know Mitchell is going to fully commit to his grappling. And like I say, if he gets Barboza down, I could definitely see him getting a finish. I don't want to bet on Mitchell, though, because remember what I said. This guy is extremely difficult to take down. Barboza is very, very, very hard to take down. And if Mitchell can't get this fight to the ground early, or if Barboza survives the onslaught in round 1 and drags Mitchell into the second round, into that 6th, 7th, 8th minute, I think Mitchell is going to be too tired to defend himself on the feet, and I think he will get brutally knocked out, because he just doesn't have the striking or the gas tank to defend himself in the second half of this matchup. So this is a fight where I see a lot of risk on both sides, and I don't mind putting my money in situations where there's a lot of risk, but I need to get a good risk to reward ratio for my money. I need to be able to get a very good payoff. And because neither of these guys are at big underdog odds, there's just not a good risk to reward ratio for me on either side with these fighters. So this is a matchup that I'm more than happy to pass on, and very difficult for me to have a lean, really. I guess it's dog or pass Barboza, but I wouldn't feel great about it. So if we look at this next fight now between Alex Oliveira and Kevin Holland, we can see that Kevin Holland, one of the biggest favourites on the card, at average odds of about 1.30, which is minus 333 for an implied probability of 77%. And if we take a look at the odds on Alex Oliveira, he is currently around an average of 3.80, which is plus 280 for an implied probability of 26%. Alex Oliveira, 34 years old, 5'11", with a 76.5-inch reach. Kevin Holland, 29 years old, 6'3", with an 81-inch reach. So very nice size and reach advantage there for Kevin Holland. He's going to have a 5-inch reach advantage, approximately a 5-inch reach advantage over Alex Oliveira, and be a little bit taller as well. And obviously a major X factor to discuss in this one is one of the main reasons why Kevin Holland has a big size advantage in this matchup is because he is making his welterweight debut in the UFC. Has fought a welterweight in the past, but he's making his welterweight debut in the UFC, which is an interesting move because he has fought at welterweight previously, and the last time he fought at welterweight was all the way back in... Where was it? Sorry, in my research session. It was all the way back in 2017 against Curtis Melender in a fight in which he missed weight for. He missed weight by 3 pounds. So that would suggest, with him missing weight for the Melender fight and then since then moving up at middleweight, that would suggest that Kevin Holland has a pretty tough weight cut to welterweight, which is also, always going to be a bit of a concern, because one of Kevin Holland's biggest weapons is his amazing gas tank, right? This guy can go hard for 5 rounds, no problem. The only time we've ever really seen this guy gas was in the Darren Stewart fight, but Holland came out afterwards and said that he was dealing with some pretty significant knee injuries going into that matchup. That was the reason why he gassed. Aside from that, Holland's gas tank is undeniable. Absolute nightmare. This guy can fight at a high pace, no problem whatsoever. And so it'll be interesting to see how different he looks at welterweight. How he's going to look at welterweight is something that we can't really speculate on. We don't really know. But it will be interesting to learn if Holland looks a lot better at welterweight or possibly looks a lot worse. You never really know how it's going to go. In terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, it's an interesting fight because both do have pretty big weaknesses that the other can exploit. But GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental. And what he meant by that was that consistency, decision making, strategy, game planning and fight IQ were often the biggest factors in determining which fighter came out on top. If everyone is skilled, if everyone can strike, everyone can grapple, and everyone, shows up in decent shape, fight IQ and strategy and game planning can often be the difference. And I really feel strategy, game planning and fight IQ will determine the outcome of this fight as well. I never want to be disrespectful to fighters, right? These guys are like 100 times the guy I will ever be. They're so brave. I would never have the balls to go in an octagon and fight. So I always like to choose my words very carefully with breakdowns like this. But one thing that has categorized both Alex Oliveira and Kevin Holland's career is not their lack of skills, but their lack of fight IQ. And the decision making, strategy, game planning for both Holland and Oliveira is very poor. that makes betting on both guys very difficult because they're both very unpredictable. You never know what they're going to do. When you look at two guys who are consistent, it's a lot easier to predict how a matchup is going to go because you can look at how one guy's set of skills match up against another guy's set of skills. Whenever you've got a fight involving Oliveira and Holland, though, that kind of analysis doesn't work because we can look at the strengths and weaknesses of both Oliveira and Holland from a technical point of view, but we don't know which ones of those skills they're going to use and what mistakes they're going to make, which will get them into trouble. It's a it's a minefield. Whenever you've got guys like this, it's a minefield for betting because not even they know what they're going to do. So how the fuck are we supposed to predict what they're likely to do? And so I can break this one down from a technical point of view in terms of giving you a general picture of how both these guys perform, both standing up and on the ground. But just take everything I say with a little pinch of salt. Don't take it too literally, because when you're dealing with these guys, trusting them to do what we think they're going to do is not a smart thing. It is definitely not a smart thing. So, in terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view on the feet, Holland will definitely have the advantage because he throws a much higher volume of strikes than Oliveira. Oliveira is one of these guys that wants to be all the way out of a range where he can be hit, or all the way inside blitzing forward. And his boxing's not very good. He's got a kicks-based style of striking, and he likes to hammer his opponents with big singular kicks from a safe distance. That could be a pretty difficult strategy to employ against Kevin Holland, because Holland, with that reach advantage, he does fight very long, he's very rangy. He's going to be able to chip away at Oliveira from a range where Oliveira is going to have to cover a lot of distance to get to him and land back. Holland also just throws a very high volume of strikes. So whereas Oliveira will just look to hammer you with big singular power strikes, Holland peppers you, constantly peppers you. And it's very difficult to outwork that. Very difficult to match that volume. A guy like Oliveira is going to really struggle to match that volume. So I do give Holland a big advantage on the feet. A lot of people rate Holland very highly as being a really good MMA striker and all this kind of stuff. I am not at all in any way impressed by Holland's MMA striking. I think he's a very sloppy striker. If you go watch footage of Holland and pay close attention to the footage, you'll see that his boxing just isn't very good. He also has a predominantly kicks-based style of striking. He's quite bad defensively. He doesn't read his opponents particularly well. And when pressured, he kind of panics a little bit and shells up and doesn't react at all well to pressure. His striking defense goes out the window. His combinations also aren't that fluid. He has a tendency to flail his arms around a lot. He's a little bit uncomfortable on the feet, but he's game, he's tough, he's scrappy, and his volume is going to be difficult for Oliveira to deal with. Now, when it comes to grappling, what is interesting about how these two guys match up on the ground is that grappling is the Achilles heel for both of these guys. Their lack of takedown defense and how weak they are on their back has got them into a lot of trouble in a lot of their past fights. There is no doubt in my mind that Oliveira has a huge, I'm talking really big advantage over Kevin Holland on the ground here. Oliveira is a very strange fighter, a very, very strange one, because he's one of these fighters that is a very good offensive wrestler and has a very heavy top game. But he very rarely tries to take his opponents down. Even though he's very good at taking people down and very good at controlling them from top position, he very rarely does. And this is where we come into poor strategy, poor game planning, poor decision making. But Alex Oliveira is also another strange grappler, because he's one of these really weird fighters that is very good offensively and very bad defensively. So Oliveira is a nightmare if he takes you down and gets on top of you. But if you put him on his back, he's just like a beached whale. He has no idea how to work his way back up to his feet, and he's very easy to hold down. This is strange, and this goes against the general rule. A general rule is, if you're a pretty good grappler offensively, you're usually a pretty good grappler defensively. Oliveira breaks that trend. The guy is a nightmare offensively, very, very weak off his back defensively. Holland is all kinds of bad, right? Bad takedown offense, weak off his back. You know, the Jacare fight was a fucking glitch in the Matrix. It was an anomaly. I don't know how the fuck he did what he did off his back against Jacare in that fight, but more often than not, Holland's takedown offense is a joke, and he looks even just as bad as Oliveira off his back. So this is one of those really interesting fights where Alex Oliveira has a clear, easy and obvious path to victory. If he comes into this matchup with a grappling heavy game plan, takes Kevin Holland down and controls him from top position, this fight's a fucking cakewalk for Oliveira, and he probably wins a comfortable 30-27 decision. Problem is, what we said at the beginning of this breakdown, Alex Oliveira never fucking tries to take guys down. So even if he does have a huge advantage over Holland on the ground, he's probably not going to use it. And so in a stand-up fight, Kevin Holland has got a big advantage because he throws a much higher volume of strikes that Oliveira is not going to be able to keep up with. So from a betting point of view, if you really want to bet this fight, this is clear dog or pass for me. You have to go with Oliveira. There is no fucking way in this universe I would be betting on Kevin Holland as a big favourite when I know Oliveira's got the offensive wrestling, the top game, to cause this guy absolute hell and dominate this fight. But you've got to make a decision for yourself as to whether you want to bet Alex Oliveira, because while we absolutely know he has a big advantage over Holland on the ground, he never fucking tries to take guys down. He's infuriating. His bad fight IQ is just like literally the most frustrating thing you'll ever see. And so as a result of that, you've got to choose whether you want to put your money in a lot of danger. Because if you bet on Alex Oliveira to win this weekend, he is the kind of guy that will have you screaming at your TV for a takedown because he just refuses to take his opponent down. He could be getting lit up on the feet. He will still refuse to take his opponent down. But on the flip side, you bet Kevin Holland, this dude's also going to have you screaming at your TV. Because if Oliveira does take him down, this guy Holland, you know he's going to lie on his back doing absolutely nothing. So, you know, that I hope you found that useful. It's not the kind of fight I'm interested in betting. Both guys, horrendous fight IQ. It is a minefield. Alright, now let's talk about the final fight that we are going to cover in this video. But don't forget, you want to watch breakdown videos for all the other matchups on this card, head on over to my website, mabettingtips.com, link in the description below. You can also chat to me 24 hours. I'm online all the fucking time, guys, working my bollocks off. You can chat to me directly in the VIP chat room, got any questions about gambling, betting on MMA, all that kind of stuff. I can use my experience to try and help you. And on there, you'll also find a wide range of bets, which I think you'll like. So, Greg Hardy against Sergey Spivak. We start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. We can see that Sergey Spivak is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.50, which is minus 200 for an implied probability of 67%. And if we take a look at the odds on, where is my guy, Greg Hardy, there he is. Actually, I don't want to call Greg Hardy my guy. He doesn't seem like a very nice person. Greg Hardy, 2.75 plus 175 for an implied probability of 36%. So, Greg Hardy is 33 years old, 6'5" with an 80.5-inch reach. And Sergey Spivak, 27 years old, 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. So, both guys roughly the same age. Roughly the same, well, they're not roughly the same age. There's actually a 6-year age gap in this one, but it won't have too much of an impact. If anything, Greg Hardy's probably got the advantage here in age. He is the older fighter, but at 33 years old, he's closer to his best at heavyweight than Spivak, who is very green for a heavyweight at 27 years old. He's an absolute baby for a heavyweight. A 27-year-old heavyweight is like a 23, 24-year-old lightweight. Absolute baby, and very, very green in the division. So, Hardy with a bit of a size and reach advantage, nothing major. Age shouldn't play too much of a factor in this one, which is nice. First fucking fight in this video where that's been the case. And yeah, let's jump into how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view. So, if we start with how these two guys match up when it comes to strike. In fact, there is one more X factor I want to talk about with this one. Greg Hardy and Sergey Spivak are two interesting fighters because what usually happens, like Greg Hardy and Spivak, Greg Hardy and Spivak, they're quite young for heavyweights. 27, 33 years old respectively. They're quite young heavyweights. And yet what's happened is, where you would expect these guys to be getting better and better from fight to fight, both Hardy and Spivak both appear to be getting worse, which is a very strange phenomenon. You would expect these heavyweights to really be making big steps forward from matchup to matchup, really improving, and they're not. They're definitely regressing, which is a very strange phenomenon that you don't see very often, but it's something that I've just kind of got to point out. So, in terms of how these two guys match up from a striking point of view, I do give Greg Hardy a pretty big advantage. He moves a lot better than Spivak, he hits a lot harder than Spivak, and he throws a much more diverse range of strikes than Spivak. One huge issue that I have with Spivak's striking is that it's very easy to put him into a defensive shell. If you look at his fights, as soon as he starts to feel he's second best in striking, he goes into a defensive shell, becomes tentative, and instead of trying to win the fight on the feet, he instead reverts back to self-preservation and becomes very defensive. Now, I don't blame him, because if I were an MMA fighter, I would curl up in a ball and cry like a baby as soon as the fucking bell rung. But Spivak is a guy that puts self-preservation and defense above winning the fight on the feet, which is a huge issue, because when he's facing superior strikers like Greg Hardy, it will not be that difficult for Hardy to put Spivak into a defensive shell, and from there it will not be that hard. It won't be that hard for Hardy. It won't be that hard for Hardy to outwork Spivak on the feet and outstrike him. So I do give Hardy a pretty big advantage on the feet. I think his power is going to cause Spivak quite a lot of trouble in this one. Now, on the ground is an area where Spivak will have a clear advantage. The problem is that Spivak doesn't have very good offensive wrestling. Now, Hardy's takedown offense isn't bulletproof, but you do need to get in tight to him, grab a hold of him, and actually really exert some energy to get in on his legs and hips and upset his balance if you want to take this guy to the ground. Spivak doesn't really do that. Most of his takedowns come above hip height. He's not very fast, he's not very explosive, he doesn't look like a particularly strong grappler, and in order to grab a hold of Hardy, to get close enough to Hardy and drag him to the ground, he's going to have to put himself in some danger on the feet. Remember what I said? Very easy to put this guy into a defensive shell on the feet. I'm not sure he's going to be willing to put himself in the danger he's going to have to put himself into to drag Hardy to the ground. If you go back and watch the Marcin Tybura fight, Tybura is a far better grappler than Sergey Spivak, and yet Tybura had to take a decent amount of damage before he was able to get inside and drag Spivak to the ground. It's not all bad news for Spivak though, because Hardy is one of these guys that if you force him to grapple just a little bit, he will get tired very, very quickly, and if you take this guy to the ground, he tends to cave and quit very, very quickly. So it's not like Spivak needs to use a lot of grappling in this fight to have success. It's just a case of whether he is going to have the confidence to do that, or if Hardy's going to be able to keep him on the outside, put him into a defensive shell, and deter Spivak from coming forward and pursuing that takedown. So on the feet, I think Hardy does very well. On the ground, Spivak does very well. The question is, can Spivak get this fight to the ground? And that's a difficult question to answer, because it's, again, mental. Does Spivak have the confidence to get close enough to Hardy to drag him to the ground? So it's an interesting fight. I am thinking pretty hard about betting Greg Hardy here. I haven't made my mind up on this one yet, but like I always say, you gotta let the odds do the work for you. So I haven't bet Greg Hardy yet, but he's on my radar and I'm giving him some thought. The reason why Greg Hardy is interesting to me as a bet is because the way that you beat Hardy is by forcing him to work hard, so that in the second half of the fight he slows down, and then you can kind of take over. In the second half of the fight, he becomes easier to hit because he's tired and sloppy, and easier to take down because he's too tired to defend himself. We know he suffers from asthma. Hardy will slow down if you make him work. So that's how you beat Greg Hardy. The blueprint has been written on how to beat Greg Hardy, but we've spoken a lot about game planning and strategy and tactics in this breakdown video, and we talk about it every week. We talk about fight IQ. We talk about fighting being 90% mental. Hardy is very good at pacing himself. Hardy knows his gas tank's not the best. Hardy knows his limitations. He's a smart guy. And so Hardy's not a guy that is going to go out there and burn himself out. He's not going to go out there in round one swinging for the fences trying to kill Spivak. That's not going to happen. He's going to try and pace himself over 3 rounds. And if you don't force this guy to work, his gas tank is going to be just fine over 15 minutes. He's going to be able to chip away at you for 15 minutes, win a comfortable decision. So the reason why I'm interested in Hardy as an underdog bet here, and I don't know if I'll bet him, and I haven't bet him yet, but the reason why I'm thinking about it is because the way I look at this is, if Hardy can put Spivak into a defensive shell, like a good number of Spivak's past opponents have been able to do, if Hardy can put Spivak into a defensive shell early in this fight, Spivak is unlikely to be able to make Hardy work enough to tire him out, and therefore Hardy's going to be able to perform at a pretty decent level over 3 rounds. And with Hardy being such a big underdog, I always say you've got to let the odds do the work for you. I don't know if I would say Hardy is the most likely guy to win this fight, but his odds are very interesting. His odds certainly give you a better risk to reward ratio than Spivak does. So it's an interesting fight for me. I don't know if I will bet it. I don't really talk too much about how I'm doing anymore online, but I am having a lot of success betting on sports at the moment and making far more money than I ever have in the past or dreamed would be possible. And so I really carefully consider who I am betting these days, because when I fire off bets, they're pretty big these days. And when I look at a guy like Hardy, I know I'm going to be putting my money in a lot of risk if I do bet on him, because he does have asthma and he is going to struggle if the fight goes to the ground. And, you know, he does have a tendency to slow down in the second half of the fight. But those 3 things mean nothing unless Spivak has got the confidence to come forward and make him work. And I'm not sure if Spivak does based on past performances. So Hardy is a fighter that I still need to give some thought towards. So I hope you found that breakdown video useful. Thank you for watching this. I really appreciate it. If you like these breakdown videos, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe. Check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. I hope you do really well this weekend and make some cash. And like I say, hope you found this video useful. Take care, guys. Have a great week. Have a great Saturday night watching these fights. And I'll see you all same time, same place next week. Take care, guys. Bye.